Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Aryan and today we're talking about the Sony A7 III and whether it still holds up going into 2021. Let's find out. So this camera is very dear to my heart because this was the very first professional camera I bought. I bought it almost, I would say 3 years ago, and I've used it religiously ever since. I think this camera is the reason I fell in love with filmmaking in the first place, and today I have a job working in the industry, and I would say it's kind of all thanks to this thing here. So today in this video I'm kind of hoping to break down my experience, the pros, the cons, everything I know about this camera, and in the end we'll kind of discuss whether or not you should be considering this going into 2021. Alright, so a very quick disclaimer before we get started. I'm not really a photographer, so this video is pretty much just going to be focused on the video capabilities of the A7 III. If you were looking for some photography kind of comparisons, this is not the video for you. I'm not really a photographer and I don't really think I'm qualified enough to talk about the photography features of this camera. So yeah, sorry about that. So without wasting any more time, let's get right into the video. So the specs of this camera. This camera does 4K and 24 and 30 frames a second, 1080 up to 120 frames a second. It's gonna let you shoot an HLG and an S-Log. It's got some really good autofocus and some decent colors. So for today's standards, I would say this camera holds up pretty nicely. I mean, think about this. When this camera came out, the only other camera people really compared it to was the Canon 1DX Mark II. And that camera I would say is way more than twice the amount of this camera. So now that you know what this camera is capable of, let's go over some of the pros and cons. Starting with the pros, and number one would be the 4K image. I mean, this camera does 4K, which is downsampled from a 6K sensor. And it is ridiculously sharp. More often than not, I think you're gonna find yourself using a ProMIS filter to kind of soften up the image a little bit. It's just really sharp, really good, and you're not gonna have any issues with it whatsoever. There is a slight crop in 4K 30 frames though. I think it's 1.2 or 1.25, something along those lines. It's very subtle though, nothing too crazy. Number two is the 120 frames a second. I mean, we gotta talk about slow motion, and this camera does it really well. 120 frame slow motion, it's just so good. I wouldn't really say that at this point it's future proofing, because I think in today's day and age it's kind of standard to have 120 frames a second. But when this camera came out, it wasn't that standard, and the fact that it had it was amazing. It was future proofing. Now that we are in this future, I would say you're definitely not worrying about falling behind. So I think you can definitely compete with everybody out there with the 120 frames out of this camera. It's just that good. I would say about 55 to 60% of the stuff I shoot on this thing is in slow motion, and I really love it. It's amazing. So number three, and definitely the most important for me, would be the autofocus. I've said this in other videos in the past, I really rely on autofocus. I would say 99.6% of the time. I think in my 3 years of using this camera, I think there were maybe 4 or 5 shots where I was not using autofocus. I found out very early on in my career that I was horrible at pulling manual focus, so I had to buy a camera that was really good at autofocus, and this thing has never let me down. I really love the performance of this thing, if you can't tell already. But of course, no product is perfect, and neither is this camera, so let's go over some of the cons of this thing. There aren't many, just a few, and I just want to make sure you guys know. We'll start off with the smaller things and then we'll move on to maybe potential deal breakers for you guys near the end. So con number one would have to be the colors. I personally don't have too big a problem with the colors coming out of this camera, and that's mainly because I really haven't used any camera with better colors than this. People say Canon colors are a lot better, which I'm sure they're right. Like, way too many people are talking about it for it to not be right. But I kind of grew into this camera and I used it from day one. And I think if you know your way around Premiere, it shouldn't be too big a hassle. That's just my opinion. But I think like every single person on the internet is talking about how Canon colors are better than Sony's, so I'm gonna put it under this category. But I really don't think it's a deal breaker. If you know your way around Premiere, you'll be fine. So con number two would be the build quality. Now don't get me wrong, this is in no way a cheap feeling camera. Feels very good to hold, very high quality, but there are just a few problems I have with it. Number one, the grip. I think it just needs to be a little bit bigger. I mean, your pinky never really fully rests on it. Like, there's really no place for me to put my pinky. It's just like a little bit too small, just a tiny bit. I think they've fixed that with the newer cameras, the A7S III, the A7R IV. They have bigger grips, they feel better to hold. And the other build quality thing is these damn doors. I really hate these things. These micro HDMI doors, the headphone jack doors, they're just really bad. There's no other way of saying it. They're horrible. And of course, it's been addressed in the newer cameras. They have nicer, higher quality kind of doors that don't feel like they're gonna fall off all the time. So the third little nitpick I have is the SD card slot. I mean, there's nothing fundamentally wrong about it, but just a minor nitpick, I just really hate that it's backwards. I mean, I'm looking at the back of the SD card every time I put it in the camera. If I can get it to focus, I should be able to see which SD card I'm putting in my camera, but every single time I have to look at the back. It's nothing too major, it just really triggers my OCD every single time, but of course it's not a deal breaker, it's just you gotta flip the card around, that's about it. So the final thing that I would consider a potential con for this camera, and this is a big one, and it's two things actually. Number one would be the bitrate for the files. I mean, you're getting 4K at only 100 megabits a second, which isn't a whole lot. And 1080 120 is also at 100 megabits. And if you're just shooting 1080 24, you're limited to 50 megabits a second, which isn't the best thing in the world. And if you're somebody who really likes to stylize their videos a whole lot, you might run into some issues there. The color starts falling apart a little bit sooner, but that's just if you like to do some intense grading. I always recommend don't shoot an S-Log3 because this camera is no good for that. S-Log2 is the way to go. I made a whole video about it, you can check it out up above. And the number two thing would be the Apex color. Same thing, it's just not good enough to push the color in post too much. I mean, I'll do a before and after here. I grade them kind of, I would say, a little bit on the heavier side. Nothing too crazy, but just don't expect to really go ham on the color. Like keep it conservative, that's all I'm gonna say. So the final verdict, would I recommend this camera going into 2021? The answer is yes, but under very few circumstances, not at all. Don't even think about it. Let me explain. So if you're a beginner or a hobbyist or you've been into filmmaking for a couple of months, 100% this camera is worth every single penny. I mean, I use it for client gigs all the time and I've never had a single client come back to me and say the camera quality wasn't good enough. It's incredible what you get for this camera, 4K, 120 frames a second. It's just all the good stuff, worth every penny. If you're planning to make content for like YouTube or like other online platforms, absolutely this camera is amazing. I would argue that you don't even need anything better. Like this right here is everything you need for making really high quality videos online. So lastly, even if you are a professional, you're doing weddings or maybe you're doing commercials for local businesses, I would still recommend this thing 100%. I always say that in the professional field, it's a lot more about the lenses you have than the camera body. Personally speaking, the biggest difference in quality in my videos that I saw was when I got rid of my kit lens and switched over to the Sigma 2470 Art. That, in my opinion, made a much bigger difference than if I was to switch from the A7 III to the A7R4. So yeah, for professionals, I still recommend this thing. Just focus on lenses a lot more you are on camera bodies. That's gonna make the biggest difference for you. So now moving on to the small percentage of people who I don't recommend this camera for, and that would be the people who already own one. Now that's not a joke or anything. I personally don't think that you should go out and buy an A7 III as like a B camera in 2021. Us as filmmakers, we always want to have multiple camera bodies. I mean, it's just handy to have, but I really don't think this is a good buy as a B camera. That's just not a smart idea whatsoever. I'm personally in that situation right now. Like I have two A7 IIIs. I have this one and I'm recording on one right now. And I'm looking to buy a third camera in 2021 and it's not gonna be another A7 III. The technology I feel like at this point is getting a little bit older, and for someone who's already used this camera for a long time, I feel like I need an upgrade. But that doesn't mean at all that I'm gonna stop using this. This is still a great camera to keep using in 2021, don't get me wrong, and especially if you're a beginner. But for me, like I feel like I've gotten the most out of this camera and I need to push myself a little bit more. So if you're in that situation like me, where you've already used one for many years and you're looking to pick up a B camera, I would recommend you switch that to an A camera and keep your current camera as your B camera. So buy something better like the A7S III or the potential A7 IV that's supposed to come out in 2021. Buy that and then keep your current A7 III as a B camera. That, in my opinion, would be a better use of your money and your skill set. You're not going to bore yourself for another year or two, and you're still going to get what you need from your A7 III and whatever camera you choose to buy. Now, of course, that doesn't mean I don't recommend this camera for everybody else. As you can probably tell, I love this camera a lot. I couldn't say enough nice things about it. It's the reason I fell in love with film, and I think it could be yours as well. Alright guys, that's it for today's video. I really hope this helped you out. Don't forget to leave it a like, subscribe for more videos like this, and I'll see you guys next time.